So look, I'd like to introduce our first guest to us this morning, and for those of you who've known me for a little while, you might know that I have a degree of political side to me as well. I've been involved with the National Party in, first of all, the old Waitakere days with Paula Bennett, and then with Te Aratu electorate for many years now as well. And that's obviously brought me into play with some very, very interesting people that have been on to lead our country. And as a result of that, I've got to know the former leader of the National Party, Simon Bridges, very well. He's an old Te Aratu alumni, for those of you who follow Simon's career. Simon was also, believe it or not, back in 2014, the leader and convener of an electric vehicle summit in Wellington that we attended. And I'd argue one of the first ministers to take the idea of electric vehicles into the market in New Zealand seriously, convened a very good panel session we had, and some of the ideas we're seeing today in the electric vehicle sector came out of that summit meeting that Simon convened.
Some of the good ideas.
Some of the good ideas. There were some pretty crap ones as well, to be fair, but they didn't make it out of the light of day. As you probably know, Simon now has a bit of a role with the Auckland Business Chamber. He's the head of the Auckland Business Chamber, and he, I suspect, has quite a few good stories to tell. So without any further introduction, Simon Bridges, great to see you here this morning. Welcome up.
Thank you. Hey, well, thanks very much, Graham, for that warm intro, and thanks, Richard and AutoTalk, for having me. It's great to be at Little Creatures. Almost makes me want to have a beer, but see how we go. If someone brings me one, it might improve the experience for both of us, and that'd be good. I came out here exactly a month ago. I raced out. The traffic was much worse, and I got in here, and I raced in, and I was, to put it politely, not too happy because no one else was here. And my secretary had put the wrong day in my diary, but that's okay. Today you're here and I'm here, and so that's a really good thing. Look, let me just sort of talk a bit about a few bits and pieces of business scene and you know what I think is going on in New Zealand, the world, the cosmos, politics. And you can take as much of it seriously or not as you kind of want. The first thing I thought is to sort of say, Graham's absolutely right. He's sort of stolen my thunder at a level, but I was the Transport Minister actually for 3 years. I was Associate Transport Minister, I think, for 2 or 3 years before that. I loved transport, right? I reckon it was the best portfolio. I enjoyed energy as well, but transport was amazing. And I had 15 portfolios over the time or something. So they were right up there. Transport was absolutely my favourite. And it is true, and if I do say so myself, that I had the buzz for electrics kind of before anyone else did. And I remember in Cabinet, my colleagues kind of thought I was not on the right page on that. And, you know, I had to be kind of tricky to get anything through the government at that point in time. And it's also true, actually, back then, that the OEMs, the big car companies, not all of them, Mitsubishi, for example, was pretty good, Audi, I think, from memory, BMW, but fundamentally, like everyone else, they were kind of like, you're not on the right page here, mate, and they would pour cold water on all this. And it's, dare I say it, an irony to watch some of them now saying how, you know, they've always been into this and how it's the future and all that. I do think EV is the future. That's not to say a bad word about a ute or anything else that's going on out there, and the technology's obviously got to improve, and, you know, we're going to need to see solutions in heavier vehicles and vehicles for farmers and tradies and so on. I don't agree. As Richard said, some of the policies we see at the moment are good, some of them not so good. I don't agree with taxing people who need a vehicle and don't have viable other solutions. But I do actually agree with the incentives, right? I don't know if they've got them exactly right, but fundamentally I agree with the incentives. I reckon it's a good thing we can do in terms of climate change. And the reality is in New Zealand, and you know this, but when you plug your car in, you're filling up with clean green energy, right? I mean, it is hydro, it's geothermal, and it's wind. Whereas if you're over in Aussie, you're filling up with dirty old coal, in reality. Yep, so it makes a lot of sense in New Zealand. I was also, just while we're talking about that briefly, Climate Minister for a while, Associate Climate Minister for a while. And one of the things you do, you may have seen if you're watching the news at all, and don't blame you if you're not, but if you're watching the news at all, right at the moment in Egypt, there's a climate conference going on. They call them COPs, right? Conference of the Parties. I've been to several. By the way, and they are the most goddamn soul-destroying things you've ever seen. I mean, you think this is something you go into that, they're literally in massive, the biggest auditoriums in the world. There'll be 10,000 people, and they are politicians, officials, and professional hangers-on, right? And they are paid to be in a state of perpetual outrage, these people. Yep, I mean, they are just literally, it is like it's performative, it's an act, right? And they know what they're going to do, and they're going to say, they know, by the way, that the result will be exactly the same at the end regardless, but they do. I've seen people banging shoes on tables. They just, they're really carried away with it, and it can make you cynical, but at the end of the day, you've got to kind of do these things to move and inch things forward. I personally, and I'm not just saying this because I've just been talking EVs and I'm here, I personally think for New Zealand, all of that's fine, and the climate minister needs to be at those things, but in the end, what works and what will work for New Zealand is reasonable, practical policies that take things forward, not kind of big economy-wide things where we're going to do stuff to hurt farmers' competitiveness. So to me, it is EVs and incentives there. That's like 20-something% of our emissions, right? And then the other sort of broadly half of our, the other, to get to 50%, the other part of our emissions fundamentally is industrial and, and hospitals and schools. And there's practical things we can do there, right, about getting our boilers and so on that heat these places from coal to woody biomass. And then in relation to farming, look, I personally think what we require is rule changes that allow farmers to do what I would call biotech, some would call GE, but, every other country does it these days. There are technologies and there are things we can do around the grasses that sensibly lower our emissions without kind of, as I say, having to kill all the cows and hurt what's actually been the golden goose or the golden cow over the last few years for our economy. Look, I'm not, these days, I'm out of, obviously, politics. I retired in May. Graham's right, I grew up in West Auckland, and I don't know, are we in the West right now, or anyone who's got a house here probably says the North? Do you? I don't know, it's probably better but it's good to be sort of back out here again. And as Graham said, I'm CEO of the Auckland Business Chamber, and amongst other bits and pieces, podcasts, columns, I don't know, all sorts of things. Podcast today, after this, by the way, I'm doing a podcast with Dion Nash. Remember Dion Nash, the cricketer? He has a company called Triumph and Disaster, I think. Skincare. Any of you brave enough to say as a male you use as skincare products? There you go. The handsome guys at the front too, so there you are. The chamber and what we do there, it's a bit of an octopus, right? And I just say this to any of you, possibly a few of you are members. It's got a big membership. It's got a lot of tentacles. It does a lot of random things as a result of history that you probably wouldn't appreciate that it does. We run the Centre Parade, right? So I think it's coming up on the, 30th of November. Are there 30 days in November? Something like that. Last Sunday of November, I reckon, is right. We run the biggest driver's licence training program in New Zealand. Right? We train more young Māori and Pacifica Kiwis fundamentally into driving than anyone else, bar none. And the reason for that is because we started doing it a long time. It's pro-employment, it gets people into jobs and skills, and so that's something we do out in Manukau. We run a raft of other things, but at our heart, and it seems to me what we need to be about is Auckland and business. Yeah, business and Auckland business and Auckland. And if it's a big Auckland issue, at the end of the day, it's probably a business issue. It's something that business should be motivated about. And my view, having grown up here, spent 24, 25 years here in Te Atatu, going to the Bay of Plenty for 20 years and being back and sort of thinking I knew it in the 20 years between that, because I was up here staying here probably once a week with politics and so on, is that actually Auckland at the moment, still a great city. It's got a lot of good things going on, but it's lost its mojo at a level. And maybe that's as a result of kind of post-COVID funk or something, hibernation through COVID. And so we're really focused on a few things. I'm really focused on, probably because of my background in transport and infrastructure, You know, I reckon right now Auckland needs some strong voices who are pushing, as radical as it sounds, for cars and freight, you know, and for being able to get around a city freely, you know, because actually we believe in climate change, we understand that we need to do things, but in the end we had some really unrealistic policies. So I spent quite a lot of time on that in an outfit we run called the Auckland Business Forum. We spend a lot of time thinking about the city, but actually the city's issues in terms of the CBD are Auckland's issues, you know, crime, antisocial behaviour. I live in Grafton these days, and I don't know if you saw just on the crime for a second, I don't know if you saw on the news, I think it was in the Sydney Online, my 10 and 8-year-old boys loved it, my 4-year-old girl was appalled by it, but basically, what was it, 2 nights ago, they shut off both highways going both ways, you know, and there was, I would say, 30 police cars and dogs, and, you know, it was, and the helicopter was going, and they did that for about 40 minutes, and I think, I don't know, and a police officer tragically was really badly hurt, and I think he is still in hospital, but, you know, we've got significant crime and antisocial problems that need dealing with, and so I want to be there sticking up for that stuff. I think another thing, actually, about, say, the city, but it's true in a bunch of places, and sorry if you're all kind of completely anti this, but I just reckon we need to get workers back into the workplace in a bigger way, right? We're probably always going to be at hybrid working at a level now for good, and I actually at a level do a day a week at home, but the balance of sort of 2 days in, 3 days out, it's not good enough, right? And actually, if we want a strong city, we need more workers in the buildings, sort of 3-4 days a week. So I'm really focused on that. Another one, actually, we're really focused on is events. And by events, and Auckland is a destination, right? And what I simply mean is, actually, if you want a strong city and you want things happening and you want places like this going well, you need people out and about, you need tourists, you need international students, you need all these things. And you know, what is true at the moment, if you think about events, big concerts, big things that make a city hum, that make people come from offshore for them, that make people come from around New Zealand, our budget in Auckland for doing that is less than Melbourne just spent getting a Dell, right? So they're spending 16 million, I think, on a Dell for literally 2 concerts, yep. And they've got exclusive rights to her. So, by the way, you may say that's a lot of money. The reality of that $15-16 million is the multiplier effect for that city will be 5-6 times that, right? Because they will have people coming from South Australia and New Zealand and so on, because she's only playing there, right? And they fill their hotels, and it's good for their city, and they get that. New South Wales, I mean, almost, this doesn't sound real, right? But I promise you, I've checked it out. New South Wales, post-COVID, it's over, I think, a 2 or 3 year period, they're spending $500 million on events, right? So we don't spend 15 million, right? And we wonder why sort of the city's not gone. So I'm big on that. I reckon that's important as well. When it comes to business, look, we at the Chamber are surveying all the time. I'm reading the stuff that, you know, hopefully so you don't have to, that Xero and 2 Degrees and all of these outfits put out when they're surveying and doing sort of data collection on what's going on in business. And from that and what people like you tell me, there's fundamentally one big issue in business today, right? There's another one, I'll come to that, but everything else is a long way behind. And the biggest issue is, probably won't surprise you, is workers, or lack of them. Yep, lack of workers. So I'm interviewing at the moment for a junior role at the Auckland Business Chamber. I'm interviewing because, yeah, it's a team and we need to get it going right. I had 8 interviews lined up yesterday, which I thought was quite a few, and it sort of ruined part of my day, but I thought I'd do that. Of 8, how many turned up? 2, right? So when my secretary rings them, it's like, oh yeah, no, look, I'd sort of forgotten about that. Can I do it next week? It's like far, but that's the market we're in, yeah. One of my staff, don't put this in the notes because he'll know who he is, but one of my staff, look, in that same team, because they know we've got some staffing issues, he's come and seen me. In 5 minutes, he negotiated 20 grand pay rise. He's 23, yeah. But at the end of the day, if I don't keep him, my team has got some problems, and he would go and work for the competition. Yeah, so, I mean, this is what we're sort of dealing with. In the transport sector, as I say, we do quite a bit. And one of the things we're pushing hard on there, if you take heavy transport in New Zealand right now, and there's been some people arguing about the figures, but again, I've gone and checked this and double-checked this, we have a 9,000 driver shortage. Yep. So fundamentally what that means is your rubbish won't get picked up as much. You know, the goods in the supermarkets don't get there as often as they should. And so we've tried to push Minister Michael Wood, the immigration minister, around a bit on this, and we've had teleconferences with him. I think he'll get somewhere on that, and we'll hopefully be able to, you know, get some solutions. In the end, the only solution, because there ain't 9,000 people ready, willing or able at any level to fill those roles, right? We've tried training. In the end, the answer is immigration, at least in the short term. Bringing in people who know what they're doing from offshore. And kind of, if we don't, the system-wide, the economic effects overall pretty bad. So workers is, you know, if you're in business and you haven't got a worker issue, you're a very lucky kind of a business. The other one that goes with that is just costs, right? And we know this is households and the price of tomatoes and all these things, but it's a business issue as well. And part of it is that worker piece, but it's supply chain. Talking with a car company recently, you know, their issues around supply of the things they need are quite significant. Yep. So all of these things add cost, and that affects profitability. So business right now is, I would say, pretty grumpy / some are angry. But what I would say to you is this. Whilst that's true and there's reasons for it, what's also true is I don't think the sentiment actually is exactly the same as the reality. What I would suggest to you is, if you think about New Zealand, this may surprise you because at the moment we've got a red government in power, and as you've heard, once upon a time I was blue. I'm very apolitical these days, by the way, but you know, that once upon a time I was blue. I actually think the economy relative to other parts of the world and other economies is going sort of quite well. If you're in business, yep, some are struggling, but fundamentally, and you think about your own business and what you're doing, if you're in business, you are still making money. Yep. You've got some issues, you can't get where you're still making money. We have the lowest unemployment we've had in a gazillion years. That's technical term, by the way, right? 3.2%, that's fundamentally full employment. Everyone in New Zealand who wants a job fundamentally can get a job. We've got growth. It's not high. It's what you might call grumpy growth, but what that means is fundamentally the economy's going forward, not backwards. Yep. We've got interest rates that are high, and yep, I totally acknowledge that creates stress at a level for a bunch of people. But what's also true, and it applies to none of you in this room other than Graham, because he's the only old bastard in the room, but if you go back to the early 2000s, or your parents, and actually it applies to David as well, you had interest rates in the teens, right? Actually sometimes in the 20s. Yep. And so relatively speaking, again, we're just back in a more normal position, it seems to me. What is true is that the world is a freaky place at the moment. It's got a bunch of issues, whether it's Ukraine, and you know we're so far away from it, I think we can kind of forget. But the reality of that is, you know, what people who know say is there's a 1 in 5 chance of nuclear issues there, right? I mean, they have the biggest nuclear power plant in the world, and by the way, they're throwing bombs around it. It's not ideal. So you've got that. You've got Europe that's got massive economic problems. You've got China that is got very significant economic problems, and that's our biggest trading partner. It has 60 million free apartments at the moment, right? So there's massive property. By the way, you know, if only Jacinda could have wrangled them for Kiwi Build, would be amazing, right? But it's got debt issues, it's got, it keeps going to lockdown. So the world's not a happy place, but I don't see New Zealand going to recession short of the world kind of having problems. And if it does, I personally think It's all relative, but relatively speaking, New Zealand's in quite good shape, and that's irrespective of the government. Let me just finish on, I don't know how long I've been going, Graham, but let me just finish with, I got 4 minutes, with some political predictions. I'm apolitical. I'm giving you my best objective views of life. If they're really mean to the National Party, don't write them down, because you get me, Paula Bennett and others will get me in trouble. But sort of it's what I think, and I think I am relatively objective. The first thing is, look, if you're in business today, and obviously I'm now in a position where I just rub around with people who look like you, i.e. mostly male, mostly of a certain age, mostly wear blazers, and in that demographic, most people think, it's just no doubt about it, we're going to see a change of government, right? There's going to be a move, and Labor's on their ass, and they're out. Again, that's another technical term for this, right? So that would be the view in business by an overwhelming majority. I want to suggest to you, actually, it's much closer than that. A year to an election is a very long time in the world that we're in. And the way to think about it is blocks, right? It's not so much, although I'm going to talk about the parties in a second, it's not so much the parties, it's the blocks. And on one side, you've got National and ACT, possibly that wily old crocodile Winston, we'll come back to him. And then on the other side, you've got Labour, the Greens, and possibly the Maori Party, right? It could play quite a significant role there. So you've got those blocks. So it's closer than you think. Second point is, and this is the bit don't write down because, yeah, it's too much. You can write anything I've just said, but not this one because it's going to get me in trouble. The two major parties are useless, right? Or let me put that more gently, they have significant issues at the moment, right? That take it from me as a sort of insider looking at this, that they've got sort of real systemic issues in them. On the Labour side, you've got, I like Jacinda, I like Grant, I think actually they're decent people, but they couldn't implement a piss up in a brewery, right? I mean, they just can't get it together. The only time they seem to be able to do something, it's controversial and easy, right? It's sort of Three Waters or something. So they've got significant issues on their side. On the other side of it, you've got, and I'm going to be a bit diplomatic because I'll get in trouble, but you've got a very inexperienced National Party that fundamentally, you think about it, what's the last thing you heard from them that meant something to you? They're fundamentally not saying anything, right? And so that to me it creates a very interesting dynamic a year out from the election. You look at their leaders, the shine's coming off Jacinda Ardern, right? I mean, it's just objective. Whether it's her fault or not, I'm not even saying. I'm just saying the truth is, if you look at the polls, it's a sort of a downward thing. It's probably understandable level. It kind of always happens to leaders, but that's the reality of it. The shine is off there. If you think about Chris Luxon, the alternative Prime Minister, because there's only ever really the choice of two to be the boss of the country, well, it's just as he's an unknown quantity. Actually, most New Zealanders don't really have a sense of who he is. That's potentially a good thing if it goes really well from an election campaign next year, but it's also a very significant risk if he drops the ball and things don't kind of go quite sort of right. And so that's my sort of third point, really, and that is next year, and I've thought this for a while, but the polls this week kind of confirmed what I believe. You'll see, watch the rise and the rise of the minor parties. ACT. I reckon personally Winston's back. Some of you think that's amazing, 4 of you, the grumpiest old men in the room. And some of you won't. But the reality is if he's at 3-something% right now in the polls, next year he only needs to mention the word Maori and 2 or 3 other things and that'll get him to 6 or 7, right? So I reckon he's back. On the other side, the Greens will be quite strong. They sort of always are when Labour comes off a bit. And the wild card is the Maori Party. If they win those Maori seats, more of them, which I think they possibly will, that just again means it's much closer in MMP than people kind of think it might be. So that's sort of that. It'll be close. I can see they're hovering. I've clearly gone on too long. I want to leave you with this thought, though. Don't worry, be happy. At the end of all of this, regardless of the government, New Zealand's still a great place to be. It's still a great place to do business. And I personally think we're pretty well placed relative to a bunch of other countries around the world. Hey, thanks very much. Good to be here.
I think one of my team is going to pop out from the back and with a microphone. So if you do have a question for Simon, please do wave your hand and someone will find you with a microphone. I'm going to start with a very specific question.
Yep.
And it actually relates to a discussion we've got later on today. Immigration. So that's something you're saying you're keeping an eye on. We've seen some changes brought in recently on the basis of being able, or helping to ease some of these skills shortages. We've got a speaker coming in this afternoon who suggests that they just don't work, and I think we're going to end up to... And look, people here are in new franchise dealerships. You've probably brought in technicians from overseas.
Yep.
We're hearing that basically to get someone in, you have to pay them nearly $50 an hour and their partner can't work.
Yep.
Were those changes a little bit false in what they were indicating?
I think so. I think, look, at the heart, so what they've done is they've got this accreditation system. You need to sort of register, and that's a bit of a pain in the backside. And then basically, like you say, depending on whether they're on a list, but you've got to be paying them more than market rates most of the time. It's just not a very realistic system. Look, I reckon in truth there's a bit of a reason for that that's political. The government, the current government, they... I don't begrudge them entirely, right? I think their intentions are good. They want to see those hardest Kiwis to get into work, right? So they are trying to squeeze the lemon and force business to take those really hard case Kiwis into work. And they also, look, because they see themselves as a union and workers' party, they want to see the wages go like that. They just want to see them continue to rise. The problem, I would suggest, that's not in the end that realistic. And what they forget is that business have choices. If it's unrealistic, in the end, they just, and I see this in a lot of business, they just wind down a bit, right? They just do less. So they ration the working. The other thing that's going on here is you always got to put this in the context of the world. And in the world right now, I don't know how it's happened, get someone smarter than me to explain it, but we've got this massive supply problem around everything, including workers, right? They've just disappeared. So we can't blame the government for that. It's New Zealand's problem is the same problem Aussie, America, Europe, everywhere has, right? There's just a shortage of workers. So what does that mean? That means there's a battle for talent. And the problem is, unless our immigration settings, we like to think we're the best little country in the world. We're pretty good, but Australia's pretty good too. Unless our immigration settings have a pathway to residence and staying here for that Filipino worker, right, or that Indonesian worker, or that Chinese worker, or that Indian worker, or that British worker, unless it's easy enough for them, they're going to say, you know what, I've looked at this, I can be a healthcare worker in New Zealand, Australia, or Canada. Canada is nicer to me. At the end of it, in 4 years' time, I become a permanent resident citizen, where I don't in New Zealand, I'm going to Canada. Right? So it's not good enough. The government keeps tweaking the settings to make them a bit better, and they're going to do that for our truck drivers soon, I reckon, because we're putting so much pressure on them. They keep doing that, but just being a bit better isn't good enough. Actually, what you have to be is better than the others, i.e. Australia and Canada and Britain and the like.
Are you on top of much of the detail around the clean car standard?
On top of much of the detail, let's go with at a level.
I'll ask you a question that's not really about it, but about how the government's handled it. We're now, I can't the exact weeks, but I think, we're actually past the first date of when things start processing on it.
Yep.
The government released the regulation last week.
Yep.
Is that a professional move from a government, or is that just, is it forgivable from a business perspective, giving businesses literally days to...
No, and I mean, this is my point around their inability. If you've got to do these things, look, even I think sometimes the wrong policy well implemented is still kind of better than nothing sometimes, but the implementation matters, and that kind of unpredictability, some might say chaos, is no good. I mean, at a really high level, not being over the detail, really high level, my view would be on the whole incentives, tax, clean car kind of mojo. I agree with the incentive side of it at a level. I think it's right to G up electric vehicles, because I think in truth it's a cheaper policy for New Zealand if we're to meet some climate targets than, you know, as I say, screwing the farmers and hurting the productive part of our economy that pays for our hospitals and our schools, right? So I agree with incentives. They have to be paid from somewhere, but I think fundamentally I don't agree with the tax side of the scenario, because I think, again, what you're saying is you're saying to the productive side of the economy, in the end, New Zealand is a real economy kind of economy. It's farming, it's tourism, it's kind of pretty practical stuff. You're saying to them, we know you haven't got another viable alternative. We're going to tax you anyway to pay for that bit. And to me, that's just not a pro-business, pro-economic kind of way of doing things.
I kind of look at these things about, you know, you're talking mentioning business there. And I go back to the low emissions contestable fund, which you put in place when you were Transport Minister. I look at that there. There's a case of a government working with essentially business to get where they needed to go. I mean, do you think this government's has sort of lost sight of needing to work with business? Because I mean, the contestable fund's still in place. It's allowed companies like ChargeNet who are in the room and others to roll out just amazing infrastructure in New Zealand. I mean, have they forgotten perhaps that sometimes it's better to work with business rather than just chuck a load on them?
I think in government it's easy to get bogged down, and I think that's been a problem for this government, is they haven't kind of realised that you do. I mean, I know what it's like in my new roles, and you know, perhaps you do too, right? I mean, in the end, if you're in media, you've got to get out and talk to people to get the stories, right? You can't do it from your desk, and I think there's a bit of a sense in the government that, you know, they can kind of do it from sitting there in the beehive rather than getting out and understanding. We would have no government's perfect. John Key's government wasn't, but what I do know about John Key is he and the guys right at the top were really clear. You had to, if you were energy minister, you had to be talking to the energy companies. If you were transport minister, you had to be talking to the sector, so that, you know, sometimes they'd be BSing you, but fundamentally, if you hear from enough people in the auto dealers sector that, you know, the clean car standard's got this issue and it's unworkable for this reason, or it's going to cause these fish hooks, if enough of them say, you know what, they're probably right, you know, and you modify your position. But if you're not getting that feedback, of course you're not going to do that, and you stick with a flawed policy, badly implemented.
Look, before Simon goes, does anyone else have any questions for him? David over here. Deborah's coming with a microphone.
Oh, they're going to give you a mic, David. I texted him this question earlier, so I really appreciate it. No, I didn't. He was at the gym with my older brother pretending to do weights. Yeah.
Just a comment about the implementation of the Clean Car Standard. We've been donkey deep in this from VIA's perspective, from the Used Vehicle Import Association, and it's going to be a disaster.
Yeah.
We're running out of time. We've put the highest possible pressure, including legal action, on the Minister to defer the implementation, including from the most senior people at NZTA and the Ministry of Transport requesting a delay. And it looks as though, I'm sort of probably speaking out of school, we've got working groups working with officials. We've not seen this level of cooperation from officials ever in my 20 years experience. NZTA are throwing everything at it, but it looks as though they're going to have to throw 80 extra staff at the Clean Car Standard to implement things manually to make it happen in January. It's going to be very difficult. So the people in the room who are involved, my suggestion is to open your accounts, play with it now, because it's going to be very difficult come January.
Interesting. And look, maybe take it offline, David, but I'm very happy for you to give me a bit of guff on it. I mean, in the end, have quite a bit to do with Michael Wood, who I presume is the minister, because, you know, he's immigration, he's labour, and he's transport. And I mean, I'd be happy to sort of have him on about it a little as well. Isn't that amazing, though? I know it's not what David was asking or saying about, but they're going to get somewhere 80 more staff onto this. And we wonder why business doesn't have any staff, right? And they'll be paying a lot more too for them to work sort of 9:30 to 3:45 anyway.
I think the interesting thing is there's probably not many people in this room who don't think incentives for EVs are a good idea. It's just the systems that have been put in place, being put in place at the moment, are just not functional. That's the issue. Look, any last questions from the crowd? Oh, one down the back there.
What do you think about the move for the ports from Auckland to up north?
Yeah.
Does the Chamber have any influence over that decision, and do you think it's even feasible?
Yeah, at a level. I mean, look, I sort of did, and I probably could and should have talked a bit more about Wayne Brown, and because it's good fun. And look, I was thinking about it on the way where I say it's not, but it's a true story. I didn't vote. I didn't vote for him. It's because I didn't vote. I forgot. It's really bad coming from a former politician, but there you go. But if I did, I would have, right? And because I think in the end he read the mood of Auckland right. It's quite a lot of, as I say, frustration and anger. And I agree with him on his AT staff and the need to shrink the bureaucracy and all that. My personal view is I don't think I'm with him on the port. The Chamber's view would be, we're not going to kind of take a massive position and say, because reasonable people have different views. Some of you be sitting here saying, oh, yep, actually in this crowd, maybe not too many of you, but be saying, yeah, we need to move those ugly cars and we want to shrink the port and we want to get our city back and all of that. And look, I can understand that. Look, I in the end, though, what we said, and that we've got a bit of pickup and was reported, where when he sort of goes on about all of this and has his jihad against the port, I just think there's some simple questions he needs to answer, like what will it cost? Where are the cars going to go? Who's paying for it? What does it mean for freight? And he just hasn't answered any of those questions. So it's all good. Look, what he would say is, I've had this view for 10 years. If you didn't know I was wanting to get rid of some or most of the port, then you must have been living under a rock. Yep, okay, fair enough. But it's all good having a view. Now he needs a sort of a realistic plan around it. And I don't think he has that yet. So that would be sort of what I'd say.
Fantastic. Look, great. Thank you so much for joining us, Simon. We've already sent the first box of beer down the back because only kind of one person got their hand up that time. David, it wasn't a question, it was a statement, so you're out of the competition. So, look, thank you so much for joining us, Simon, and everyone, round of applause for
Hey, thanks very much for having me. Good to see you guys. Bye.